Here's a thought. If you want people to like your show, stop insulting them. Attacking the audience has become a reflexive defense in Hollywood these days. Whenever something bombs, like Birds of Prey or the recent gay rom-com Bros, the director, writer, and cast immediately go after the very people they want to watch their show. It can't be that people genuinely didn't like it, or that they have fair criticism. No, they must be liars, grifters, bigots, and trolls. That's the gist of this Hollywood Reporter article about J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, the first-time showrunners of The Rings of Power. The article attempts to explain, or really to make excuses for, how badly the show has been received by fans by giving insight into how two guys with zero experience running the TV show wound up heading the biggest show in history. The article gives a rundown of how everyone from HBO to Netflix tried to get the film/TV rights to The Lord of the Rings, but it was Amazon that won by making, quote, a pledge of a close relationship that would give the estate a creative seat at the table so it could protect Tolkien's legacy. Well, that failed. The Rings of Power is Tolkien in name only. It diverges so heavily from Tolkien's works and his themes that if Professor Tolkien and his son Christopher was still alive, they probably would have given the money back. The showrunners have no respect for Tolkien's legacy, choosing to do whatever they want to do, even when it changes the history of Middle-earth, something Tolkien spent decades developing. That alone would be bad enough. The show was pitched to the world as telling the story Tolkien never told. The bare minimum anyone expects would be that the show would follow as close as it could what Tolkien laid out. To do the opposite of that shows contempt towards Tolkien, not respect. Worse, however, is when you find out what little experience these two had. From the article, quote, they moved to Los Angeles and spent years toiling in the screenwriting game without a big win. Their previous gig was at Bad Robot, where they punched up scripts and developed several projects, such as an abandoned Star Trek movie. We had reached a point. We had been writing movies for 10 years that should have gotten made, McKay says. Movies where the director was right, the cast was right, the script was right, the title was right, and it was a big IP, and still nothing was happening. So we thought maybe we should try this TV thing. Talk about failing upward. They spent a decade pitching films that never got made and then got handed the biggest show ever. You have to wonder why nothing they did, according to them, was ever seen good enough to produce. There must be a reason why these most awesome of awesome scripts they wrote flamed out. If they were written like The Rings of Power, I think we know the answer. The scripts probably weren't that good. The Rings of Power is one of the most mediocre try-hard shows I've seen in a while. It wants to be grander than it is, but lacks anything that could elevate it to a higher level. So much of the show is cribbed from Peter Jackson's films that it borders on plagiarism. The dialogue is this faux Shakespearean archaic English that never lands. Snails move faster than the pace of the show, and when it does pick up speed, it blazes through events, leaving no room for setting up the stakes. The characters are mostly bland or unlikable, particularly the main character, Fake Galadriel, aka Strong Woman. In fact, the cast is so superficial, it results in supposedly strong, intense relationships coming across as phony. But amazingly, the showrunners see themselves as making something grounded. Quote, in their pitch, Payne emphasized their show would be Braveheart, not Narnia. You want it real and lived in. You mean like the entire cast surviving a volcanic eruption? That would be unrealistic in Narnia, let alone Braveheart. That just proves that there are no stakes in the show. There's never any sense that the protagonist will lose or get hurt or experience anything worse than a bad day. There's no sense of urgency, no sense of desperation, no sense of drama. It's a typical forgettable fantasy yarn, but for having Tolkien's name attached, the show likely would have been written off as the half-assed Lord of the Rings clone that it is. Supposedly, Amazon chose McKay and Payne because of their, quote, depth of knowledge of Tolkien's world, a knowledge they appear to wield with such skill that they claim in the show that the elves can lose the light of the Valar and thus die, but can be saved by the light of the Silmarils, which now exists within Mithril, something found in not a single line of text in anything Tolkien wrote. It's entirely possible that these dudes are obsessed with Tolkien's works, but what they've shown on screen suggests the opposite. Otherwise, they wouldn't make the severe changes they've made. They're not just adding in new things, but fundamentally altering the world and the history of Middle-earth. These are the two people Amazon put in charge of the show, people who admit they have no idea what they're doing. Quote, the entire making of the show has been a massive learning experience for everyone involved. We had no idea what we were getting into. No one else did either. Well, that may be true for you, but if you watch the appendices for the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit films, you know that there were plenty of people who knew exactly what this was like, and they probably would have helped you if you reached out to them. This shows the showrunner's level of inexperience and explains why the show is a mess, which they actually admit in the article. They claim that they can handle criticism, such as with the pacing issue. Quote, One of the big things we learned was even when it's a small scene, it always has to tie back to the larger stakes, Payne says. Why would you need to learn this? It should be obvious that whatever you show on screen, particularly in the long-form format, needs to tie back to the main story, otherwise it risks derailing the plot. You've been writing for 10 years and you just learned this. You should have noticed this as you reread your scripts. Hell, if you've ever read a long novel or watched a long-form show or a long film, you'd have learned this by osmosis. Are you not critiquing your own work? Is that what's happening? And then McKay says, quote, there are things that didn't work well in season 1 that might have worked in a smaller show. How would you know if you've never ran a smaller show? Also, it still wouldn't work. The size and scale of the show, or whether it's about the mundane or an epic fantasy, wouldn't change that the more you take focus away from the main plot and story, the more it slows down the narrative. This is basic storytelling, something any decent writer would catch the moment they reread their work. I can only imagine that the reason these two failed at this season is because they're in their own heads. In the article, they say they hoped the first season would be better received as the season unfolded and people rewatched the first episodes. As Payne says, quote, some things get an immense amount of critical acclaim and win tons of awards and are forgotten the next year. Conversely, some things don't get a lot of love, yet become classics being watched 60 years later. I think it'll take a while for the dust to settle. Nah, son, the dust is settled. Very few people are going to rewatch this show, let alone consider it a classic. It will be spoken about for years, though, as what not to do when adapting the beloved work. The audience response to the show has been mixed at best, but generally critical, and Amazon, the showrunners, and the cast's response to that criticism has shown that this show wasn't made for fans of Tolkien's works. From the article, quote, yet Amazon has long known that they were in for a rather bumpy series takeoff. They saw Tolkien fans slamming the Rings of Power online before a frame had been released. We all saw it coming. There was no surprises, Jennifer Salk says. Having insight into our global audience, we also have insight into the darker sides of how people can manipulate reviews and have other points of views we wouldn't support. What is your evidence that people were manipulating reviews, and what were these points of view you wouldn't support? The article doesn't say. Instead, it jumps to what Amazon did to stop the so-called manipulation of reviews by shutting down reviews. Quote, so the streamer announced it was switching off reviews of the show on its platform for the first 72 hours after its premiere, then kept them off for an additional 5 days. The company continued to monitor reviews. Some vanished so fast, it was like they were wearing the One Ring. In short, Amazon blocked reviews for a week because they knew people wouldn't like the show, and now they're admittedly deleting critical reviews to make it look like most reviews are favorable. If only there was a word for that kind of thing. Ah, yes, manipulation. Amazon is manipulating reviews while they're accusing other people of doing the same thing. Quote, Amazon claims there's been a coordinated effort to attack the show for daring to diversify Tolkien with strong female characters and people of color. Coordinated by whom? What group is telling people to go and hate on the show because it changed Tolkien's work? I get that this is a narrative the media and the far left love, as the article acknowledges, but it's one that falls flat if you bother to listen to the criticism. The criticism is that the changes aren't true to Tolkien's works. His stories are based on medieval Europe, so the world plays out the same way they did in the real world, meaning women wouldn't be in armor fighting in wars, they wouldn't be commanders of armies, and the peoples of Middle-earth, not the entire world, just that section of the world, would be Caucasian. That applies to the men, the elves, and the dwarves. That is what Tolkien wrote, and it's what he wrote that people want to see, not your half-assed reimagined fanfiction. If you wanted to tell a story that was so-called diverse, you should have just made up your own story. Clearly, it would still be poorly written, but no one could accuse you of bastardizing Tolkien's work, and then you wouldn't have to accuse everyone who doesn't like your third-rate fanfiction of being a bigot. Quote, Tolkien's world has a long, unfortunate history of attracting fascist-adjacent admirers, something that surely would have repulsed the fantasy world's anti-totalitarian author, whose Rings trilogy was inspired by the horrors of World War I. Italy's newly elected far-right nationalist leader, Giorgia Meloni, for example, has been an outspoken Tolkien fan, unhelpfully. I'm impressed that you can pull such a steaming pile of bullshit out your ass with your head up it at the same time. You got any evidence to back this up, or do you just like calling people names? See, the thing about you constantly using these terms against people you just don't like is that they lose their power, and eventually you're going to label the wrong people. Like me. I'm black. I've only voted Democrat or Independent. I'm dead center on the left. A couple of months ago, I pissed off conservatives because I wouldn't support Goober DeSantis and his bigot brigade's Don't Say Gay bill. Unless you're planning on calling me an Uncle Tom, and that's really not going to help you, how in the fuck do you explain me? I get that the far left loves this everyone's a fascist argument, but I have a functioning brain, so this shit doesn't work on me. If you want to make a claim, I want the proof. Prove that there's this contingent of bigots fawning all over Tolkien's work. Keep in mind, you're claiming that this has happened for years, implying these people are actually fans of his work. So you're also going to need to explain how they all missed that Tolkien was against totalitarians and authoritarians when it's all over what he wrote. And while you're at it, try to figure out how you missed that Tolkien despised the idea of anyone taking his stories and twisting them to fit their political agendas. You know, like Payne and McKay did. The article also mentions a similar response to the race swap in the House of the Dragon. However, even that race swap makes a little sense in context to the lore that George R. R. Martin wrote, which is intact in the show. I'm specifically talking about the culture depicted in the show, which is that of medieval Europe. Women are treated as second class in the show, which is accurate to the time period. Gay people are reviled, which is accurate to the time period. However, none of these white folks have a problem with the only all-black house in Westeros. They're misogynistic and homophobic, but not racist. That seems plausible to you? People's criticism is fair. If you're basing your fictional world on a known culture, people expect that those who live in the fictional culture would match those who live in the real culture, and that they'd follow the same cultural norms unless otherwise explained. When you deviate from that, it looks off. It's worse when the point of the story is to focus on real cultures, like Tolkien did. Anyone who knows Tolkien's stories would know that reclaiming this lost lore of England was important to him. When you make the show multi-ethnic, you're undoing the very thing he was trying to do. But the showrunners disagree. Quote, Payne looks particularly distressed by the topic. The spirit of Tolkien is about disparate peoples who don't trust one another and who look different from one another, finding common ground in friendship and accomplishing big things, he says. Yes, the Lord of the Rings is about that. The Second Age, however, is about the hubris and greed of man, and what happens when men aren't grateful for what they've been given and instead seek what they were never meant to have. Numenor goes from being the nation of the greatest men to outright tyrants, and in punishment, it's wiped off the face of the world. It's not a positive story about diversity. Did you not read the Akalabeth? He goes on, quote, That's the spirit we try to inculcate into every single comma and period in the show. That this aspiration would be offensive to people and enrage them is very hard for us to understand. That's a lovely straw man you have there. Who's enraged by different people finding commonality in friendship? Give me examples. Present your evidence of someone criticizing the show because they don't like the idea of people from different backgrounds getting along. Show it to me or keep your forked tongue behind your teeth. He continues, quote, What are they protecting? The thing you should be protecting. Authority was not given to you to trash the legacy of J.R.R. Tolkien, steward. These aren't your stories. They don't belong to you, and no one is here for you. We are here for Tolkien. We want to see his world, not your reimagining of it. If you love the man's work, you would want that too. Instead, you set out to change his work, to write the novel he didn't write, tell your own story using his name with contempt for the world he created and the themes that guided his hand. You aren't the hero. You're the villain, which is why you cite a villain in defense of your choices. Quote, There's a line in episode 7 where a strong woman says every war is fought from without and within. Even if you're fighting for something you think is good, if you're doing something worse in that fight, then you become evil. I don't see how people who are saying these things think that they're fighting for good. It's patently evil. You mean like strong woman wanting to leave one of her soldiers to freeze to death, or lying to a queen about someone wanting to reclaim a throne, or threatening to torture and genocide every orc, but keeping their forebearer alive to watch so he can suffer before he dies. 'Cause that's what you wrote into the show. You thought you were making Galadriel strong and powerful, but you stripped her of every bit of humanity, wisdom, and genuine strength she had, making her the worst person in the show. She is patently evil and a total desecration of everything Tolkien stood for. Did you learn nothing from the lines you cribbed from Jackson's films? I don't see how you can do such a thing and think you're fighting for good. The article wraps up by discussing the ratings and where the second season is headed. With the ratings, the issue comes down to House of the Dragon, a show that has better numbers, broader and more positive appeal, and a 2-week lead. An insider claimed that Amazon is more bothered by HBO's show than they're willing to admit, especially after it brought in 20 million viewers for a second episode. The showrunners also complained about it. Quote, Suddenly, the media and fandom world wouldn't stop talking about dragons versus rings because, let's face it, everybody loves a fight. It dominates the narrative about how it's received, McKay says, but it was not at all part of the narrative in how our show was conceived. Hopefully, we're competing against ourselves. Nope, you're not. You're competing against a better show, and losing badly. House of the Dragon has everything the Rings of Power is missing. Great dialogue, excellent pacing, interesting characters, and a believable, intricate, grounded world. It's got tension, drama, and intrigue, and manages to maintain this despite massive time jumps every couple of episodes. The problem with the Rings of Power is that the showrunners didn't have a clue how to approach the story. They claim to be fans of Tolkien's works, and maybe they are, but they definitely aren't stewards of it. They lack any understanding of Tolkien's works, and apparently any respect for it or the man himself. They're only interested in the world they're creating, using Tolkien's works like stolen scoops of sand from someone else's sandbox. They're hoping, as they admit in the article, that the third-rate intrigue of who is Sauron pretending to be will be enough to keep interest, but that's a weak premise for watching the show, and it's already lost its allure because so many characters could be Sauron. They're banking on people's love of the Jackson films and Tolkien's works to carry them, especially as they get closer to the final battle with Sauron and the hell that follows, saying, quote, "That's the secret sauce of Tolkien right there," Payne explains, leaning forward. "The grimmer things get, the more those pops of light have contrast to bounce off of. That's what's beautiful about Tolkien. Even in complete despair, you can have two halflings look at each other and say, 'I'm glad you're here with me.' You're forgetting the rest of it, here, at the end of all things." Because that's what this show feels like. It feels like the last of the great stories being reduced to a cash grab and idiotic virtue signaling. But maybe there can be a eucatastrophe. Maybe it'll suddenly turn for the better, and eagles will come bearing two ladies and some old gray-bearded man to save the day. Hopefully Sir Peter hasn't dyed his beard, because that kind of ruins my metaphor. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.